Hey, welcome. We'll get started in just a few minutes, but we just wanted to say hello and let you guys settle into your seat, grab your last cup of coffee before we get going here. That's Jeff. He's grabbing his last cup of iced tea, or is it iced coffee?
It was 95 this week in Phoenix, so it's iced tea.
It's not 95 here in Seattle.
Yeah, that is for sure. Hi, Susan. How are you?
Hey, I'm good. Good morning, everyone.
Great. Glad you could join. We're going to be kicking off in just a sec here.
Oh, good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
I'm gonna try to fix the lighting in here. I'm sorry.
Cindy, you look like you're in witness protection.
I know. I can't figure out how to do this West Coast thing. It'd be fine if it was cloudy and raining in DC. No, that's
Usually you're in the bright.
I can't. I have no idea what to do.
Oh
I think
my
I'm
God.
gonna take another computer maybe and move it to another room. All right, sorry about that. Darn you, sunshine.
That's
All right, I'm
Cindy
gonna
Tag
leave
from
this.
Economic Development Administration. She's been very busy. She's not in the dark. There's really a bright light shining on everything she's doing.
I'm gonna just
Yeah.
disconnect and go somewhere else and hook back up. Sorry about that.
Hey, John, thank you for joining. I appreciate it.
Of course. I'm looking forward to it, Jeff.
Good stuff.
All right.
So we go about one more minute, Karen, because we've got folks joining. I don't know if Nathan is on the security desk where he's hitting admit as fast as he can, but we'll get rolling here. We had quite a big crowd last time, and we had a lot of folks that stuck around not only for the event, but stuck around afterwards for a little bit of Q&A. So this will be well attended as well.
Yeah, a lot of people asked about whether or not the sessions were recorded, and they are recorded, and the slides are also going to be available. So if you missed the last one, you'll be able to listen to the recording on that one. And we've also taken the feedback you gave us from the last one and incorporated it into this session, and we'll continue to invite your feedback and make changes as we go along. So you'll see a couple of updates this time.
Great. All right, I think we should get rolling here, Karen. It's 2 minutes after the hour, and we're gonna go ahead and get started. I'm sure everybody joining afterwards is gonna miss my little beginning, which is okay. Really, I'm here just to welcome everyone to the second Arizona Broadband Workshop. I'm Jeff Sabatka. I'm the State Broadband Director. My office sits at the Arizona Commerce Authority here in Phoenix. And I am super excited to kick off this second partnership with our 3 federal agencies, Ntia, USDA, and EDA, all of which are very big broadband funders in 2021. And we appreciate them taking time away from handing out all that money to join us here on our webinar. In March, our first webinar and our follow-up breakout sessions was very well attended. The breakout sessions were incredibly productive. It gives you an opportunity to have a two-way dialogue with us about what we're doing. And we've made a few changes, but really along the same path, just to continue moving forward. Each one of these progresses to the next one, to the next. And by the end, I think that everybody involved is going to be much more in tune, not only with what the process looks like, but what our federal partners are looking for in this. So let's go ahead and get started here. I'd like to introduce Karen Perry, from the NTIA. Karen has been our lead organizer here, and she's going to give you a quick rundown of today's agenda.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. And Shmei's going to bring us up the agenda. Next slide. So really our lead speakers from NTIA today are two of the people that I have a great opportunity to work with. My boss, Scott Woods, and one of my peers, Don Williams. They're both wonderful experts in broadband planning. And what they're going to do today is give you really an overview of what we call the NTIA broadband planning roadmap. And so this roadmap is the roadmap for really the entire workshop. And I'll give you a quick update on that in the next slide. We're going to take a break after that, and then we have an extremely exciting local panel, which Jeff is going to moderate. Sometimes we call it the doer panel. It's kind of about local solutions and partnerships. And we're excited to showcase some of the excellent providers in your area who are making things happen in building out broadband. And then we're going to wrap up as we did before and talk about next steps and the regional workshops and what we're going to be doing in those workshops, as well as about the upcoming events. Before I go, next slide, let me just give you a little bit more detail in terms of kind of what's coming next. So I mentioned that really the focus of today's program is on our NTIA broadband planning roadmap. Our broadband planning roadmap really isn't that much different from everybody else's roadmap. It is a very good roadmap to use. People have been using it for 10 years. Many of the other roadmaps are really various derivations of this one. And we're not going to really go into the entire roadmap in detail today. We're going to focus on a few key parts of it. So for those of you who were part of our TA sessions last month and our initial program, you know what we focused on in those programs were engaging stakeholders, community priorities, and assembling a team. That's what we really worked on in the TA session, because it's really one of the things that you need to get started. What we're going to focus on today is more in the infrastructure path. We're going to focus on doing an inventory of your assets, engaging service providers and other partners, evaluating your technology options as well as your business options, and then what are the considerations you need to look at when you're executing a strategy. So that is really our agenda for today's program. But I wanted to let you know that everything that doesn't have a check mark in it will be covered at another point in our program. So we have to start somewhere, and people really like to talk about infrastructure. There's a lot going on in infrastructure, and that's one of the reasons why we're focusing on that infrastructure path today. Next slide. When we go to the TA session, which will be on April 21st, and we'll have more in-depth regional conversations, we're going to dig in deeper in that path that I just talked about. And we're really going to focus in on that detailed discussion about asset inventories and rights of way. And we're going to ask you to think about those topics in more detail and think about them in your community. And we're going to help you a little bit more at building that asset inventory for your community. So the worksheets we're going to talk about at the end of this session will be worksheets to help you build those asset inventories, whether you're building your own network or whether you're building a partnership with a provider in your community. So that's basically our roadmap for that next discussion. So get ready for that program, which will happen on the 21st. Next slide. And of course, we do want you to register for our next session. And our next session on the 5th will be about harnessing the data. We do have that tribal session coming up. We have a special session coming up on resources. And as I mentioned, the digital inclusion path is very similar to the infrastructure path. But when you look at inventorying your assets, when you look at engaging partners, the way you do it is a little bit different when you're doing digital inclusion. So that path is a little bit of a different conversation, and we have a very special session on that. So that's a special session that we do a little bit later in the process. So that's just our agenda coming up as it relates to the broadband planning roadmap, which Scott Woods will go into in much more detail. And he is our next speaker. Scott?
Thank you, Karen, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. The next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the 30,000 foot level, the Ntia broadband planning roadmap, and then I'm going to hand it off to Don Williams, who you all know. He did a preview of his talk in the session before this. And so we're going to just highlight again the overall process, and I'm going to hand it off to Don, who's going to really drill into some of the steps that you'll be involved in as you go through this broadband planning roadmap process. Next slide, please. So again, just briefly, here are our pictures. I manage the Broadband USA Technical Assistance Program. As you remember, Don Williams has been a long time, community broadband advocate, worked with NTIA for a number of years, but prior to that, really worked as a consultant, worked with a lot of state and local governments and communities in developing broadband strategies. So we're very welcome to have his knowledge, his skill, his ability, his experience to our technical assistance process and program, and you'll hear from him as well. And again, you already heard from Karen Archer-Perry. She's also going to moderate a session that's upcoming on harnessing the data. Next slide, please. So again, as we talk about the importance of broadband planning and the roadmap, I just want to highlight a couple of things here before I turn it over to Don. Each stage will play a different role, right? There is a progression to the process, but as you'll see in the next slide, there's really no required order. Many of these steps happen tangentially at the same time. You'll start on one and go to another and come back. So there's really no logical process, but the way we present it is a way to help you understand. But please know that every process is going to be different. And your goal is to plan with the end goal in mind. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. Next slide, please. So again, we talk about this roadmap. What it is your vision and goals based on the community objectives that we talked about previously. What are the anticipated benefits of bringing broadband infrastructure and digital inclusion to your community? And of course, it's a strategy and action plan. And your roadmap really helps you to identify new partnership opportunities, areas of improvement with your stakeholder engagement and outreach, and other things. So it's a static process, but as you move through it, everything changes. You'll be adding information. The more people that you meet with, the more groups, stakeholders that you get input from, you'll continually change those goals and objectives for each one of those stakeholders that you interact with. Next slide, please. So again, as Karen highlighted on the first step, we're highlighting this particular step, these steps in the process. We talked about previously, and you did this in the TA session, assembling the team, identifying those community priorities. We're going to come back and talk about harnessing the data. And Don's going to pick up at considering your infrastructure and inclusion, those steps and processes involved in that, which presumably are assessing available resources, conducting some sort of gap analysis, engaging those partners that you've identified, evaluating those technical solutions, and then agreeing on a recommended strategy and approach. And then, oh, by the way, you're engaging stakeholders at the beginning of this process, all the way throughout this process. So you never stop engaging with key stakeholders. That's your state and local government officials, that's your business leaders, that's the provider community, that's people from your education, medicine, health, you name it. Workforce development, economic development. You are engaging with these stakeholders throughout the entire timeline of this process, this life cycle, if you will. Next slide, please. So as Karen highlighted before, a really successful project requires both infrastructure and inclusion. And as we worked with communities across the country, of course, the emphasis and the focus has been on infrastructure. That's where the money is, that's where all the costs are. But there's a human capital component to it, particularly when you're talking about vulnerable communities, your elderly, some people of color communities, some indigenous communities, right? We have to start also thinking about and including digital inclusion as a part of our overall strategy, thinking, and execution while we're engaging in infrastructure. So a part of this workshop, we will highlight digital inclusion strategies, but for the purposes of broadband planning and the overall steps, it is something that's done tangentially, as you're developing outreach, as you're developing strategies, as you're talking to service providers, you will also be actively engaging with those same stakeholders on digital inclusion. So we'll talk about that. Don will go into a little bit more detail as we move forward. Next slide, please. Okay, so at this point, again, we're assembling a team, we're identifying those community priorities, and then we're moving into the next step of harnessing the data. So again, we've talked about this, you've done an exercise on assembling the team and identifying those priorities. So you're familiar with that, and we'll move on. Next slide, please. So really assembling a team, just as a refresher, it's really about, you want to compose a team of broadband champions, if you will, that really has a mix of skills, right? Varying backgrounds or viewpoints, but number one, and most importantly, interest in the common goal, which is broadband, infrastructure expansion, adoption, bringing broadband, expanding broadband in the community, right? You can't have, these people pulling, these people going in other directions. We all have to be pushing, rowing, pulling, all in the same direction with a common goal in mind. That's why we talk about assembling that team at the front end, having those conversations about what your objective is, right? Is it, for some sectors, it's going to be economic growth, right? When you talk to another stakeholder, it might be institutional connectivity. Your education folks always want enhanced educational opportunities and platforms. And we've seen that with the impact of COVID. And then for your citizenry, it's always expanded e-government and government services. These are constant, objectives. You may select one, more, or all of these as some of your common goals of what you want to accomplish with your strategy. But this will be dictated by, again, your stakeholder outreach and your reasonable approach to what can be accomplished. Next slide, please. And so as you're assembling that team, just keep in mind that strong partnerships can provide both financial and personnel resources and increase project impact. So you want, again, playing on that mix of skills. Some people are going to be really strong in stakeholder outreach, community engagement, maybe dealing with people from the business sector. And then some people, you need a really mix of people who understand the financial part of it, the funding. If you're going to go after grants, right, being able to write and address grant applications and grant requirements. If you're involving a partnership with a service provider, assets, there are certain asset ownership, and Don will talk about that collective asset inventory that you can do utilizing existing infrastructure and facilities that are already available in existence in the community. And then finally, as I highlighted again, those different personnel experiences, that mix of knowledge, skill, and abilities that will be so important in executing this plan and getting it across the finish line. Next slide, please. And so as we talked about 2 slides ago, communities use defined objectives to shape their vision and direct planning teams to support their efforts. So again, when you meet with your stakeholder representatives, or to the extent that you've already started, again, you'll have different visions and goals and objectives, right? So if your vision is going to be economic growth, you want to make sure you have your government representatives involved in the team, any development organizations, obviously the service provider community, any business leaders from, entrepreneurial all the way to, manufacturing and other businesses that you have in the community. Again, there are other examples here for the brevity and interest of time. I won't go through all of these. Again, this slide is available. These slides will be available, and this recording is available. So you can always come back and touch on these. So institutional connectivity, expanded e-government, enhanced education. There's telemedicine, right, that we haven't even talked about now, particularly with the impact of COVID, in your health community. That will also be a vision, a goal, and objective for you to consider as well. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned before in the first slide, you're going to be engaging all of your stakeholders throughout this entire planning continuum, this process. Next slide, please. And so let's just talk about what does that mean, engaging stakeholders? That's a really fancy phrase and statement to some people. But all it is strengthening your relationships with people who matter, who are going to help you fulfill, implement, execute this goal, right? You want to seek areas of agreement, and you want to reach out to new stakeholders. So what that means is, again, and we've oftentimes worked in the community, and that is reaching out to not just the business community, but making sure you have service providers represented, you have health, education, business, children's groups, parents groups, like you name it. All of your stakeholders, you want to have input into this plan, into this process, because that momentum is going to help you execute. It's going to help you sell the vision. It's going to help you execute and sell this plan as you move forward. So again, you have your planning team. You want to share that vision. You want to discuss assessments and findings. You want to share those initial plans, initiative plans, and then provide feedback all along the process to both your community residents and all of those stakeholders that we've talked about. Next slide, please. Also want to note that if you're a community leader, you can make stakeholders a critical part of your effort, right? You start from your key stakeholders when the planning process begins. Again, making sure your local officials, your state officials are on board. And then as you go through the continuum, you want to bring in, as I stated before, your business leaders, your local service providers, community organizations, and then individual citizens that can champion one or more of these issues throughout the process. Please note that the why stakeholder outreach is so important because it really helps galvanize project support. Provides multiple, we call it two-way communications, but in this age, it's more than two-way, right? And you want to be transparent, right? You want everyone to understand and know what you're doing, who's involved, right? We don't want any, claims of nefarious activity or anything like that. You want the process to be fair, transparent, and open. Next slide, please. So we're going to pause right here. We're going to take a poll. And so the poll is going to pop up. But as you all know, recent appropriations, both on the state and federal level, have allocated more funding for broadband infrastructure, right? For computers, for training, for support. So which stakeholders right now, if you're thinking about this right now in a vacuum, which stakeholders should you be working with right now to help you pursue those funds, right? So click the box, hit submit, and we'll talk about that in a few seconds here. And so while you do that, again, you have people like Jeff Sabaka from the State Broadband Office, you have tribal government officials, representatives from the local internet service provider community, that could be WISP or co-ops or other participants, other representatives, right? State and local representatives, city, tribal, government, other government entities, nonprofit groups and the faith community, schools, libraries, banks, local citizens, local businesses. And if you have one that's not listed, you can put that in the chat as another idea. So take some time, fill out the poll, and we'll look at these results here in about 20 seconds.
I think Shemay knows me too well. I guess panelists can't vote, so I can't vote for myself here, but there's some really good options. And I know a lot of our communities are working with multiple. So if you're working with multiple, please do check them.
Yep, and Monica Babine had a great input on the chat, public safety, right? Make sure that we're engaging in a public safety community as well for infrastructure enhancements and improvements. We want their input. Of course, if you're, we have a program here at Commerce with FirstNet, which is a nationwide public safety communications network. But again, we can talk about that. I said could only check one, not multiple. Okay. We're supposed to be able to check multiple, but if you can't, if you can use the chat function and put some ideas in there, we'll be able to do that. Yep, Stephen Burrell puts in congressional representatives to the list as well. Yes, you want to have a strategy to engage your local elected officials, both on the federal, state, and local level.
Hey, if we can only check one, we might as well call this poll because I bet everybody wanted to check a lot.
Absolutely. Yep, healthcare. See some people say, here go. Right now we have the results.
Oh boy, are
There we
they
go.
buttering you up, Jeff?
Ah, Jeff. Absolutely. So
I'm just excited post-COVID, we can get back to traveling and meet with y'all in person.
Again, there are no wrong answers, folks. This is just, again, all of these are stakeholders that you're going to interact with, that you should have a strategy to interact and conduct outreach activities to. So, there are no wrong answers here. But Jeff does win as being the host. Actually, he comes in second as a city, tribal, county, or local government entity would be first. I wonder if that includes Ntia and our Broadband USA program on that. All right, folks, thank you. That just gives you a look. Again, depending on where you are, again, there are no wrong answers. This just gives you a sense of who the local stakeholders are. And again, if you are applying for appropriations or have plans to apply for appropriations, either through the state of Arizona or through the federal government, again, you want to have a plan to conduct outreach to all of these entities. I would also note too, on the federal level, a lot of grant programs require letters of support. And so these are the individuals that you would reach out for letters of support regarding your efforts or a project. So again, we can move on. Next slide, please. So a little bit here on Harness the Data. We're going to preview an upcoming workshop where our own Karen Archer-Perry is going to moderate it. This is a fairly new development in broadband planning as local jurisdictions, as states, even the federal government here at NTIA, we have our national broadband and availability map, but data and mapping is very important now in the planning process, because you have to understand and know where broadband is and is not. And the only way that we can effectively do that is to provide some type of data analysis, conduct some type of data analysis to figure that out. And so we've dedicated a session to that. You go to the next slide, please. We've dedicated a next using data as a foundation for your plan, moderated again by Karen Archer-Perry. That's going to be held next session, Wednesday, May 5th. And just an example of some of the data sets that we're going to highlight, our own NTIA Internet Use Survey data. The FCC has data sets that we can access. The American Community Survey by the U.S. Census Bureau, a number of open and closed private data sets, like speed tests by Ookla. MLabs has an open speed test. Ookla's private. U.S. Census Bureau has a ton of data on demographics, income, broadband, computer use. We have our own at Broadband USA. Like I said, the MBAM Broadband Now is another one. And then we're going to demonstrate how to use these tools, utilizing an i3 tool that we found that's helpful for the community. So you'll be able to access and explore your own community's data, and really that will help you build a foundation for your broadband planning efforts. So when you get this presentation, you can click here to register, but more information will be coming from the state of Arizona folks, as well as from Broadband USA. So stay tuned. All right, let's keep moving. Next steps, next slide. All right, so now you are going to hear from Don Williams. So I'm going to bring Don on. He's going to walk you through these specific steps around infrastructure and inclusion. So Don, without further ado, I will pass the mic to you.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate it. And thanks again, everybody on the Arizona team for getting all this together all these weeks and going forward as well. We all appreciate that. So it says consider infrastructure and inclusion. I would like to make the word consider, a little stronger. I do infrastructure projects around the country and have for a long time. But my feeling is that the best networks are networks that are full of users. And to be full of users, and this includes both rural America as well as urban America, you need to pay attention to digital inclusion. Next slide, please. So there's a variety of ways to think about digital inclusion. We're going to talk a lot about infrastructure today, but we want to talk a little bit about digital inclusion to start with. And it involves essentially providing educational opportunities and equipment and information on how to use skills that are necessary for working in the digital world. And it's also important at the beginning here to see what it is your community currently is doing. What are they doing to bridge the digital divide at the moment? And who is taking action? And the most likely folks in most communities to be taking action turn out to be the libraries, schools, some wonderful nonprofits doing wonderful work, as well as churches and local governments around the country. Also, there are some community colleges that have really taken up the digital literacy adoption programs, and they're being very, very useful in their communities. So I think that the main thing is the best network would have every single entity passed on the network, whether it was an institution, a residence, because networks that are full of users are networks that are going to be successful going forward, both financially and in terms of their economic development impact. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next few slides, I had written up a number of asset inventories several years ago, and we've been using them here at Ntia and other groups as well, because one of the things you want to do early on in the planning process is to understand what it is you currently have, both in terms of providers, as well as what infrastructure behaviors do you have in your community that can help defray the cost of future broadband deployment and expansion. And you want to look at the market niches that are not being served in your community. And the best way to do that, of course, is to initially contact your providers. And there are a number of providers in different communities, in addition to the ones that you may already know. And the point of the analysis is that the information is going to allow nice assessment of strengths and weaknesses in a number of the areas which we're going to talk about.
Hey, Don, excuse the interruption. I'm sorry. Can we go to the next screen, please? There we go.
Oh, sorry, yeah, I forgot to.
No worries.
That's good. Anyways, so this is the general slide that introduces these asset inventories that are going to be coming up. Next slide, please. So this is a fairly straightforward slide talking about performing a gap analysis. And the gap analysis is basically you're going to be looking at an inventory of existing resources and assets regarding broadband. And you're going to be looking at what your community needs as a vision from your task force, your broadband champions. And you want to make certain that when you're doing these needs assessments, you're assessing both institutional needs, which are businesses, hospitals, educational facilities, medical facilities, hospitals, as well as what your residential users are looking forward to in the future. Because remember, as we've all known now with COVID, telework is becoming very institutionalized across the country. And good connectivity for residential users is more and more an important part of your general economic development strategy. So we want to talk a little bit about each of these things going forward. Next slide, please. Okay, so this one has 5 inventories on it, and we're going to move to the next one right away, which is an inventory of physical aspects, physical facilities and community resources. So when we're doing these asset inventories as a task force, it's probably a good idea to first assemble a listing of folks you want to ask questions to. And they run the gamut from people in permitting to zoning, your economic development people, your utility folks in particular are very useful in all of this, whether that's a private utility or a public utility. And some of these costs are going to be, if you have electric plant trench with available conduit, that's a wonderful technique, because remember, much of the cost of deploying underground fiber networks is the initial trenching, the digging of the earth. And to the extent that you have already existing systems underground that can either absorb another conduit that you can put fiber into, or that someone else can put fiber into, those are very important aspects of this fiber inventory going forward. There are also ideas about shared conduit that are in some of the larger communities, and people really don't know quite that the conduit is there, and they're not sure who the telecommunication providers are, because often those providers are not providing service to residential areas at all. But we want to know about them and get a good feel for that. Similarly, we want to get a good feel for the telephone poles. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Number one, aerial construction generally tends to be significantly less expensive than underground. But when you're doing your telephone poles, if you have a right to use them, and even if you don't, it's good to get some idea of what kind of work the poles have to have done to them in order to accept another communication lines. And that's called make-ready work. Next slide, please. Okay, wireless. The wireless is nice because there's a lot of communities that are going to be doing fixed wireless for the foreseeable future until we get to the gold standard of fiber connectivity for everyone. The nice thing about the wireless is that every community has got a water tower. Every community has some sort of a building that's a little higher than the other ones. You also want to look at the existing cell towers, see if there's anybody that's got space on them. And while local governments are tasked with managing the rights of way and planning for municipal telecommunication networks, as well as other projects, they might not have the assembled inventory with regard to assets for broadband deployment. So when you're looking at future broadband plans, it's good to have the current information on the location of assets and existing broadband infrastructure. And to the extent that you can work with your GIS people and get those on a layered map, all the better, because that will make it much easier as you go forward to designing the network. Next slide, please. Okay. So these are really policies and processes as opposed to physical entities. Is a dig once policy in effect? Now, everybody uses the term, dig once. The implementation of dig once is very dependent on what state and local locality you're in. There are a variety of different ways to approach dig once. The main benefit is once the trench is opened, people are notified. And if you want to engage in putting in conduit or fiber directly, that saves a whole lot of money. The other thing you want to do in this is talk to your transportation, your circulation folks, and try to schedule your broadband deployment opportunities with where they're doing road work. That makes it a lot easier and less expensive. Similarly, with permitting processes, I think we've all been on projects where we thought the permits were going to be pulled relatively quickly, and it seemed like they were going to be, but they're not. So if you're a private contractor and you've got construction crews all lined up, you'd be best to have your permitting speeded up or smooth, and one-stop permitting is always useful. The other idea is to get existing road providers and see what it is that their timeframes are. Last week, I had a group ask me about, they have to get a railroad crossing and they wanted to know when they should start. I said, you should start right away. Railroad crossings take a lot of time to get the paperwork through. Next slide, please. Okay, land and space. This is also incredibly useful no matter what entity is performing the broadband deployment. Plots of land that are currently unused, that are owned by the local government, particularly useful for putting up a network operations center suitable for node locations. These things will make it cheaper to actually deploy the broadband system. And remember, in rural America, it is really important to bring down the cost as much as one can, because we simply do not have the economics of linear density working in our favor. Similarly, existing wireless sites and space for Wi-Fi access points. Next slide, please. Okay, so understanding the type of build-out locations are available, that's an important step in planning as well. And it's another component of a good telecommunications inventory. So you want to know what specific service sectors are, where the areas of needs are in the community relative to planning your broadband deployment. You want to see if there's any state plans for industrial parks, new multiple dwelling units, multiple commercial units. And we want to make certain to discuss all of these issues with your local economic development agency. Every agency I have worked with for quite some time realizes that the best economic development strategies going forward are going, including really good connectivity. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think we mostly know what those are already. Next slide, please. Do we want to have the break or shall we just keep going?
I hear you, Karen.
No, we meant to take out this break.
I'm
No
taking it out
coffee
right now. Next slide, please. The break is over.
Break is over. That was a quick break.
Oh, you must
All
be a
right.
tough boss.
Break
Keep going.
deleted.
All right, engaging partners. You know, Scott had talked about some of stakeholder engagement, and stakeholder engagement, of course.
We've got one
occurs throughout the
coming up
planning
later,
process.
though.
And what we want to do at this point is we want to talk about partners. And partners are going to be a little bit different than stakeholders, but we want to treat them kind of the same going forward in our planning process. The closer we get to working with partners who can help us build, finance, design, understand broadband systems, the better it is for our planning process, all inclusive. So part of the effort is going to be to tailor your efforts in planning to the community's preferences. And we talked a little bit about a needs assessment. And we talked a little bit about how you had to, in a needs assessment, include your businesses, hospitals, other institutions, your anchors. But we also often want to include a survey of residential subscribers. And the reason we want all of this survey information is that it helps us gauge the accuracy of our penetration rates when we put together our business plan. There are a variety of ways to survey residential users. Survey work at this point is complicated, but certainly doable and important. It's good to have public hearings, but you know, my experience in public hearings, I don't know about anybody else's, is you get folks to come to public hearings and they have, you know, a particular view in mind. The survey, hopefully, is going to be randomized and generalized to your population as a whole. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are three general options. Within each option, there are a variety of possibilities, that's for sure. From a public point of view, in many ways, encouraging your local provider to build or extend the network is definitely the most cost-effective, almost always. And the reasons for that are very straightforward. They have assets in the area that are already broadband assets. That is significantly less expensive for them to expand a network than for some other group to come in without broadband assets and suddenly build the network. That's just straightforward economics. Second option is also fascinating, and that is running your network over somebody else's network. That can take a variety of forms. You can lease space, you can lease fiber, you can lease yourself a system. The problem with leasing your system, generally speaking, is it's tough to get to residential units unless you've got a system that is open access, which is a form of running your network on somebody else's system. And remember, open access is a network is built and everybody can get on it for the cost that that network is using to market itself. There are a number of open access networks, both small and large in our country, that are doing fantastic. It's definitely an option that I think we should all look forward to seeing. It's not going to work for every community, but it's certainly something to look at when you're doing your planning. The most complex option is building or extending the network yourself. I've put together a lot of feasibility studies over time, still review a lot of business plans for communities and counties. And that is a different kind of planning than working with an existing provider to expand their network. Because literally, you are going to be the one that is conducting the necessary studies, perhaps through a consultant, to see if this is a feasible issue for your community to do. And feasible in a number of different ways. Feasible financially, also feasibly politically. Because remember, if you're going to build your own network, you have to first take into account what your state law allows you to do in the telecommunication field. There are a number of states, 19 at the moment, I believe, that have some forms of restrictions or hurdles on what municipalities and county governments can do in the telecommunication field. So that is also an important first step when you're looking at building your own system, is what can you do according to state law. Recently, there have been some very wonderful developments from my point of view. A number of states this past year now allow electric co-ops to provide their own broadband service in their territory. That's a wonderful, wonderful thing. If your state does not have that yet, it's good to make certain that they do sometime in the future. Similarly, with municipalities wanting to provide their own broadband connectivity through their own devices, that's often done with cities that own their own electric plant, but it's increasingly done for cities and areas that do not own their own electric system. So these are all areas where it can be studied, and we're going to talk a little bit about running the business plan a little later. Next slide, please. Okay, so these things break into uses and users. Within each of these, of course, there's a variety of possibilities. Smart communities, the estimates are somewhere around 30 to 40 billion new sensors put out in the next 3 or 4 years for smart communities. And smart communities does not only involve urban areas, it also involves rural areas. It's just more difficult in rural areas because of the lack of broadband. Second is smart agriculture. We work with American equipment manufacturers, Deere, and some others on smart ag projects. And one of the nice things about the smart ag projects is Number one, it's also part of an economic development strategy for agricultural areas. And what you'll discover is that depending on the type of agriculture you have, what crop you're producing, you're going to have a different kind of smart agriculture. They're going to have some things in common, but there will be differences as well. Smart grid. Well, we have been talking as a nation about having a smart electric grid for quite some time. We're not there yet. But for a co-op, municipal electric, smart grid technology is something they're going to be looking at, and broadband will help them achieve that. And finally, not finally, but on the slide, telemedicine. So, as you know, rural America, they've been losing hospitals, and they've been losing doctors, they've been losing clinics. Telemedicine has always been a good idea, and with COVID, it is becoming more and more of a reality throughout the country. We now have insurance companies and doctors' offices agreeing on payment schedules and what's going to count as a paid visit. These are fundamental ideas, as well as getting doctors, but not be in person. Actually, they're now calling it a digital side manner, which I kind of like. So all those things are important. Institutions. We've got a variety of institutions that we're going to be looking at as stakeholders and businesses. As we know earlier in the planning process, it's important, as Scott had mentioned, to have a variety of stakeholders in your planning group. And that would certainly include the business community. I'm working with a city in Texas, and their task force is primarily composed of the business community, as well as the economic development folks. And finally, of course, residential users. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have another poll coming up, and the poll will pop up momentarily. There it is. I myself, we were going through this as a dry run the other day, and I said, wow, I really like this poll. And then they said, okay, we have to keep it in. So it's a good poll. I hope you enjoy it. I'm not allowed to vote. I can't believe that, but nonetheless, it's true. And here we go. Take your time.
The reason you like this poll, Don, though, is because so many of the clients that you work with find it, this is one of the questions you ask them, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Have they worked with their providers, and have they had this conversation? And you get such varied responses.
Absolutely.
So, Shimei, you want to call the poll, and let's see what we find in this group.
Sounds good.
Oh, this is good news. I think, are we surprised, or are we happy? Some of the providers are upgrading service is our winning answer.
Indeed. Well, some good things here indeed. Some key providers are currently upgrading service. That gives us an opportunity to talk about the difference between upgrading the network and rebuilding it. So a lot of cable companies in the past have been upgrading their networks, which is basically a better change of electronics, perhaps running fiber to a node in a neighborhood, and replacing the cable modems. The newer cable modems are much better than the previous generation. Rebuilding literally means you're taking down some of the existing plant and replacing it with newer plant, which is usually the replacement of coax with fiber. Building your own network. I like it.
And we also have some comments in the chat, Don. Henry says our providers have pushed their networks as far as they find it economic, and it's just not enough. And I think you've heard that before.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. I like the open access conduit that providers use. That's worked pretty well for a couple of communities. Those are communities where they put in, the public sector put in conduit and opened it up for a charge to ISPs. That is a pretty useful way to go, and it gets the local governments out of actually providing the services. All right, shall we go to the next
One
slide?
more comment though from Lisa I wanted to point out and ask your opinion on it. Lisa says there's ongoing problems that we don't always get open communications with our providers. We continue to work as a community to improve the relationships. And I know that some people have really struggled with this, and it's very different community to community and provider to provider. Do you have any tips on how to really open up communications with providers in your community?
I can take
Yeah,
that.
I mean, my recommendation is to meet with your providers as soon as you're able to, and make certain that, you know, it's not a gripe session, and discuss their plans and operations for your locality. You know, a lot of the MSOs, multiple system operators, it's impossible for the companies to upgrade everybody all at once. So it's important to discuss these with your local folks right away and see if they have any plans for the future and upgrading. If they don't, well, that's a different matter altogether. And one in rural America wants to make certain that a provider that's serving a denser town or village has some incentives to go out past 15 homes a mile down to say 8, 6, something along those lines would be great. Difficult for providers to do that.
And I would
Aaron
also
put a
add
note
to,
in the
Don, if I
comment
can,
section,
if I
but
could
I-
add on that.
Sure.
Yeah, I would also add, as part of this planning process, it's also integral to include the local service providers in this process. You know, again, the more stakeholders that you have represented, you know, business community, state and local government officials, you know, education, telemedicine, health, you know, the more providers that, stakeholders that you have in the process, and including local service providers as integral input and insight into that process will also help as well. So it's not just from one perspective as the community, it's really a holistic approach based on the needs of the community from all of those interested sectors, all of those interested stakeholders.
No, I think that's exactly right. One of the things I know a lot of communities, when they do reach out to a provider, it's difficult sometimes for the provider to say that their improvements could be made to their system. And, you know, you have to work through these and be respectful of their business decisions and some of the limitations that the locals are up against. Okay, next slide. Great. So we're getting to evaluating solutions, right? That sounds promising. It's been a long planning process. And I would like to also mention that the planning process continues after your planning report is issued and voted on, and everybody is happy about it. You still have more planning to do. Implementation planning is a big one. Marketing planning is another one. But let's move to this next slide and we'll get to some of the solutions. So select a technology based on the community needs. So I already mentioned that clearly fiber is the gold standard for connectivity. There are communities that are very remote, and it is very difficult to come up with funding to make fiber connectivity to the home or the premise a reality anytime soon. We had a BTOP program, which Scott and I were involved in together, and we had 80% grant for capital costs of the network. That allowed a lot of middle miles to be built in rural America. Without a good subsidy for capital expenditures, the economics of linear density work against providing fiber connectivity in rural America. Also want to consider the program's mission, what your target audiences are. You know, a lot of networks that governments build around this country are not residential networks at all. They're institutional networks. They're connecting public safety, city remote facilities, schools, libraries. And those institutional networks are very important to acknowledge and take advantage of when you're looking to expand deployment of a broadband network to residential units as well. So the right fit's going to be dependent on your objectives, needs. For example, terrain. Sometimes terrain is just not going to be good for wireless connectivity. There's occasions where the terrain is going to be very difficult for underground construction. I was on a project in South Carolina a few years ago, and you know, they just did not do a good geological analysis of the build, and they hit rock a lot, and it delayed the construction of the system and definitely increased the cost of the system as well. And again, you got to talk to broadband providers and equipment suppliers. And if you've got a community that seems to have done what it is you want to do, definitely go and visit. I have not found any public broadband entity that doesn't like to tell people what they're doing. And it's a great way for learning, and get somebody on the phone next time and you can, you know, hey, this is my idea. What do you guys think? So those kind of networking opportunities are key. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have a variety of different technologies going forward. Wireless, fiber, last mile, middle mile. Remember, last mile connects premises and institutions, and they need to connect to a middle mile so that they can get to an internet exchange point and be on the World Wide Web. So part of your planning process is to find out where your middle mile networks are, what the cost factors are for connecting, and where your internet exchange points are. Internet exchange points can vary from very large, like Cermak in Chicago, et cetera, or can be very small. And the smaller ones are usually a better bang for the buck for rural communities. In any event, select an organizational model. That's going to be our next topic. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, we have this scale from government owned to private sector owned and led. And as we mentioned previously, first step is what are you allowed to do according to state law in the telecommunications field. Once that is understood, then you can really begin to think about the structure of your organizational model. So we want to look at the project benefits, legal relationships, funding sources, asset ownership, and the expertise needed. For example, a number of city-owned broadband systems that are operated by the municipal electric company. They farm out much of the work involved in maintaining the system and repairing the system. And a number of the larger MSOs also do the same thing. So those are, particular ideas that you can look at. Nonprofit owned and led, again, an increasing number of entities are forming nonprofits to begin to look at broadband and to look at funding sources that are unique to nonprofits. So those are also ideas that you need to look at in your planning going forward. Okay, let's go to the next slide. P3s, okay. Again, there's a larger pamphlet on public-private partnerships for broadband. That's on our NTIA resources website. It's a few years old, but nonetheless, the way to think about it, I think, is still valid. So remember, for a broadband public-private partnership, again, check your state law. There are restrictions on what you can do in a public-private partnership in some states. So let's get that straight right away. Second, what are you going to gain from a partner, and what are you bringing to the table to make you attractive to the partner? Remember, this public-private partnership is eventually going to result in a contract. And that contract is going to be relatively, well, not relatively, it will be very detailed because we have to divide up the risk, the opportunities, revenue, responsibilities for things that don't go right. And we want to have a cost sharing mechanism dependent on what kind of a build you're going to have. All of these things are important, and they can be looked at. There are a number of broadband public-private partnerships up and running. Some of them are in rural areas. Many of them are not in rural areas, frankly. They're in areas that were already served, but in those communities, they thought it best to bring in competition and to increase the symmetrical high-speed broadband in those areas. Next slide, please. Okay, P3 models. So there's a lot of them, and they are in each one of these categories, they take a variety of forms. The simplest one is private sector led. And that's easier because the community partners with a commercial operator, and that operator builds, owns, and operates the network. The community can assist with permitting, rights of way, making easements accessible, perhaps guaranteeing that a certain number of institutions will come on to that network once the network is built. They can also assist with the funding mechanism. Next, it would be government-led, private sector supported. In that model, community owns the network, but private partners, commercial operators construct, operate, and maintain the network. There are also a number of examples of this. This works particularly well in communities that are not owning their own electric system. At least that's been the experience so far. The most complicated model is joint ownership. And I mean complicated in the sense of contractual issues that arise because you're literally both owning the network. So the way you divide up risks, costs, responsibilities becomes a little more complicated. And no matter what one of these you're looking at, make certain that you bring somebody that does risk management to your broadband planning team. Next slide, please. Okay, develop and execute a strategy. We're going to move right into what that is. Next slide, please. Great. So by this time, we know you have a program description of goals. You've probably got a organizational structure picked out, and you know who the leaders are going to be, and you're working on managers and who they're going to be and where they're going to come from. And you're also beginning to really focus on putting together a financial business plan that will be acceptable to a private sector investor or a government investor. That means a grant program or a loan program from a government. Now, a lot of folks, when they're thinking of these broadband plans, another reason why it's important to have your economic development people and your business leaders as part of your community task force, your planning group, because they're familiar with balance sheets, pro formas, income statements. And the more that you have those in detail and the more realistic they are, more likely you are to get those projects funded. And we'll talk a little bit about in detail in the next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, project plans. So all of these things are important. The executive summary is key. If you're presenting this to a group of elected officials, it's highly likely, in my own experience, that they're going to want to see a good, crisp executive summary because they may not have time in their day to read, a 200-page report with appendices. That seems eminently understandable. You want a good market analysis. The market analysis is what are the gaps that you can fill, and what is the interest you've been able to measure in coming onto your network and purchasing services, and what services are in fact you're going to offer. For a long time, everybody was trying to offer triple play. Recently, a lot of networks are really offering internet only because of cord cutting and the enormous number of different programming groups that you can just buy for whatever dollars you want a month. Very interesting, folks. Marketing and sales. Remember, the goal is to get this network full. And that means you're going to have to look at marketing. You're going to have to look at salesmanship because those are things that make this network sustainable and make it a good fit for economic development. Next slide, please. Okay. Okay. Well, to that. So the financial plan is going to have a very detailed set of costs for operation and for capital costs. The best financial plans are going to build in more money than they think they're going to spend on capital costs. And they're going to put in more money on marketing than they think they need. And the reasons for that are very straightforward. Most construction plans do not come in under cost. They just don't seem to. Occasionally, yes, but more likely than not so much. So the financial plan is going to be driven by key assumptions in your pro formas. Those key assumptions are the penetration rate per service you're offering. It's going to be also dependent on your operating costs. It's going to be dependent on the future costs of expanding your network over the course of many years. It's also going to be dependent on how do you arrange for financing for the first 3 years of the network, when really most networks are not making enough money to pay off debt. So all of those are key parts of your financial plan. And what you're going to want to do is, what you're going to want to do is make certain that you've taken a sensitivity analysis to your financial plan. And by that I mean you've varied all the assumptions that drive your pro forma. Interest rates, payback schedules, penetration rates, cost for implementation of the system, cost overruns for the system, as well as money in the mid-years of the system for changing out various sets of equipment. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the income statement. These are some of the obvious costs, the statement of cash flows, the balance sheet, and we also want the income analysis, an outcome analysis. So the outcome analysis is, you can have a simple one like this. When you're turning in a proposal for a business plan for whether it's a public entity you're applying to, or in fact, private banks, which have been making more and more loans as we go forward, you want to be certain you've calculated a good internal rate of return and that it's a reasonable internal rate of return given your market. You also want to be able to calculate a net present value for the system, because that's going to give investors an idea of, if I put my money here versus I put my money someplace else, how does that look given time value money? So all of those things are important going forward for your business plan, why it's important to have an economic development person on your team, and why it's important to have some business folks on your team as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is again very straightforward. We're looking at our revenue, our cost savings versus our expenses. Now, cost savings, we'll just focus a little bit on that as time is running short. Cost savings is often in a network that you get more connectivity, higher speeds, more redundancy, less latency than you would if you continue to lease T1 lines or something. I've worked on networks where leasing the T1 lines was so expensive, building your own institutional network, you pay it off in just a few years. So these are some of the big cost savings that you can have. Similarly, now with a lot of cities, they're having cost savings with replacing streetlights. So while the capital cost is high, the maintenance and bulbs of the streetlight and the use of electricity is cheaper. And when you replace streetlights in an urban area or a suburban area, you can rig it so that the streetlights you're putting up are also good for 5G antenna placements. We can talk about that offline again. Next slide. All right. Well, we got through that, and pleasure to chat with you all, and we'll stay around for some questions afterwards. And we have a wonderful panel coming up, that's for sure.
Now's, I think, where the 5-minute break is.
Yes, that is correct. So let's do this, folks. Thank you for joining. Let's take a short break and then we'll transition to our panel. I have 2:15 or Eastern time, which would be 11:15 your time. Let's take a short 5-minute break and then we will transition to the panel session of today's workshop. So come back at 20 after the hour. Thank you.
All right, I am back. Hey, Karen.
I'm here too. People are still stretching. It's a lot of material to get through in the broadband planning toolkit, and Don gets passionate when he gets going. He has so many stories. When we were practicing and getting ready, it was like, how many stories can I tell? He's got so many stories. And he'll join us for many of the TA sessions, and hopefully he'll have time to tell a few more stories, which are really examples from the field. And so it's great if we'll have time for some of them.
I had to turn the ringer off on my phone. My alma mater, University of Arizona, fired Sean Miller, our basketball coach, and I think I have every friend for the last 20 years texting me asking my opinion on that. Just like bing, 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 bing.
And what is your opinion?
I think the time has come. They're talking about bringing in the guy who's the lead assistant at Gonzaga, who's very good, and I just think it's time. I like him. I think he's accomplished a lot. He probably underachieved at the highest level, but it's so difficult. My brother used to be a college basketball coach and knows this guy, and I'm telling you, that is a cutthroat job of cutthroat jobs.
I'm always amazed when I look at the salaries that the football and basketball coaches make more money than the presidents of the universities and governors and just about everybody else. Definitely the field to go into.
They did a story on Nick Saban in Alabama and the economic impact he made to that university in that state. And I mean, they had economists on and everything. I think it was 60 Minutes, and they showed just the number of out-of-state enrollees, foreign enrollees, all that sort of thing. And he was actually underpaid. Now that's not the case with all of them, but they do. Some of these schools do bring a lot of money.
Yeah, sports is big.
It's big business.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, that happened right at the beginning of the call, so I thought maybe somebody had died.
Well, good that wasn't it.
Yeah, that's true.
Let me see. We
All
might
right.
have.
I have 22 after the hour, so
Yeah.
And what time did you say we'd be joining back?
20 after.
So
We're 2
and-
minutes behind schedule.
well, I'd say that are your panelists ready, Jeff?
Yeah, I can see John, Susan, and Amy. Are you guys on?
They are, yes.
All right, fantastic.
All right,
Thank you.
then Scott and I will exit stage left and leave you to your esteemed local panel and to the rest of the audience.
Awesome. Well, hey, everybody, thank you for sticking around. We've got an excellent panel coming up with three very unique business models and three great spokespeople to talk about them. We'll give each individual a chance to talk for about 5 minutes about their company and their model and what they're doing in Arizona. And then at the end, we're going to have a Q&A session. So we're super excited about that. We're going to start with Susan Annable she's the Vice President of the Southwest Region for Cox Communications. Susan and Cox have been a great partner for the state of Arizona. Probably the best example of that is at the very beginning of the pandemic. They were all in on helping a lot of our low-income kids get connected through their Connect to Compete program. I certainly don't want to steal Susan's thunder, but I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to her and give her an opportunity to talk a little bit about Cox and what they're doing here in Arizona, and hopefully maybe a little bit about what they're planning on doing, because we'd love to see you guys in a lot more markets. Susan?
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate the nice introduction. And wanted to share just a little bit for those of you who've joined the webinar today who may not be familiar with Cox. I think most of the urban communities are well aware of Cox. We are a multi-state national internet and cable service provider, and we are a privately owned and family run business for over 120 years now, but we primarily serve the urban markets in Arizona. So Metro Phoenix, Metro Tucson, we're also Pinal County and Cochise County as well. So our model, our play is largely to serve urban areas and some of the larger and growing communities in some of the other counties in Arizona. And I would say our model, and maybe speaking specifically to how we have responded during the last year and a half during the pandemic, is to really focus on helping connect the unconnected in our service areas. And in doing so, as Jeff mentioned, through enhancements to a program we have partnered with and supported for nearly 10 years called Connect to Compete. So this program actually was launched in Tucson in 2012, and it was designed as a program to help ensure low-income kids in families in the K through 12 space have an internet connection at home so they can do homework and learn, and their parents could be able to stay connected with their teachers. That was the intent of the project, and it's a service that would connect families for $9.95 a month, provide them a free installation, free modem rental, and there'd be no credit check to get them connected. So eligible families are largely the free and reduced school lunch eligible families, but we do have some other criteria for eligibility as well. But during the last year, when students all ended up going home to learn remotely, we really had to pivot on how we looked at the Connect to Compete program. We were able to offer it for free for new families that needed to enroll quickly and get online. So we gave them 60 days of free service. We ended up increasing the speeds to 50 megabits per second because no longer were these students using it to do homework. They were online doing Zoom classes with 2 or 3 siblings all day long. And so we were willing to increase the speeds and did so for the school year. We also had a fast track program to approve the eligible families and get those kids connected very quickly. So that was something that we kind of were forced to innovate very quickly on, and we're able to do so. Some additional things we did during the past year, we do have Wi-Fi hotspots in our markets we serve. We went ahead and opened those up to the public for free, again, for the duration of the school year to help out with those families that may have needed a mobile solution for connectivity. We also enhanced and promoted the Cox Digital Academy, which is a curriculum-based program, and made that available to everyone, not just our Connect to Compete families. So those were some of the ways that we tried to make sure that we were providing connectivity when the crisis was at its peak and students were learning from home, and that was the model. But we also did other things, like we partnered with State Farm and the Arizona Cardinals, and we helped secure hundreds of computers and the C2C connections for students that were lacking both. We were also able to develop an offer for working from home and learning from home called CARES 25 and CARES 50. So basically a special level service for internet at $30 and $40 a month respectively, that would be for those families that didn't qualify for our C2C program, but needed service nonetheless. Probably most importantly, we were able to set up bulk accounts. So we had some school districts and some municipalities that came to us and said, hey, we want to help subsidize and pay for the service to make sure these vulnerable populations have and stay connected. So we were able to establish bulk payment opportunities and bulk accounts for those cities, those school districts that wanted to do that. I wanted to just do a quick mention of a very successful project we had actually just to our neighbors to the north in Las Vegas, which is part of the Southwest region that I'm responsible for. The Clark County School District ended up with creating a public-private partnership with Cox and some local community organizations called Connecting Kids Nevada. And what Clark County School District did is they took their CARES Act funding and said, we want to connect low-income families so that we can have our kids learn from home for the duration of the school year. And Cox alone connected over 6,000 families through that program. And it was a very successful example of a public-private partnership to, again, connect families that already have access to a network. I know most of the interest in this probably forum is going to be around the rural opportunities. And I wanted to speak to that just very briefly as well. One of Cox's owned companies is a company known as Trapalo. If you haven't heard of them, they are a telehealth home health monitoring kit solution that is technology neutral. You don't have to use Cox's network. You can use a wireless service to utilize this technology. But basically, these are take-home kits from a healthcare provider that allow people to do home health monitoring, whether it's blood pressure, pulse, oximeter, whatever it might be. It reduces the need for in-office doctor visits, which was obviously a huge thing in the past year. So we really had to amp up our Trapalo services and make those available more broadly as people didn't have the opportunity to visit their healthcare providers as routinely. So I guess just speaking going forward where we're at, we will continue to promote and support our Connect to Compete program and the bulk solutions I mentioned earlier. We're looking for opportunities to continue to partner with local governments, schools, nonprofits who have an interest in subsidizing the cost of internet for identified populations in their community. We have also applied for participation in the emergency broadband benefit program, that's a mouthful, and look forward to being part of that solution as well. As to now, I'm sorry.
No, awesome, Susan. That is fantastic. You know, that was going to be one of the questions. I guarantee you it was about the EBB. And as one of the larger providers, we're super excited that you're doing that. Also, you know, you guys are very active in Douglas, Arizona, was one of our border communities, which is very rural, and I appreciate your help with that. I'm sure we've got a lot more questions, and thank you so much for speaking. And we're going to go to John Scarano next. John is the CEO of Wired. Wired has operations here in Arizona under a company called Zona Wired that they had purchased. John is the former co-founder of Zayo. So this is clearly not his first rodeo, and this is something that we're excited to have him and Wired here in Arizona in the Valley. So John, if you'd like to go ahead and get started, and Shmei, if you could go ahead and cut over to John.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you, panel, for allowing the participation. It was pretty interesting to hear from Susan as well. You're going to hear the exact opposite from me. We are 3.5 years old, not 125. A fiber-based broadband entity that will also support wireless. We, as Jeff said, operate in Arizona and as well in Georgia. In Arizona, we right now support Peoria, Buckeye, how can I forget, Surprise, El Mirage. And we began services by buying into a business called Accipiter Communications. The mantra we have is very straightforward. It's one community at a time. And while that may sound trite and simple, as we heard from the Broadband Now folks all together, you know, what you all are contemplating is a fairly complex business. Entities like Cox have mastered it for so long. What Wired brings to the table is a rural and urban desire. By one community at a time, basically the thought maybe that I could leave you with is expansion is expensive. The objective that we all have is to enable our residents and businesses to connect. The beginning of real expansion is community partnership. The end is funding, and everything in the middle is solvable. Core operations in a state or a region that can be expanded upon are really the secret sauce. I forget which of the Broadband Now persons said it, but if there is a catalyst, then there's an opportunity to expand. Our simple goals are to partner with entities like Cox or Zayo or others to obtain backhaul capability to connect the respective community, and then we'll build the fingers. We'll partner with you as community sponsors in any sort of way that makes sense. And really, because the country is so big and the needs are so high, the easier a community makes it to collaborate, the faster that Wired or many other entities like Wired, large and small, can be supportive to the extent that you're feeling not supported now by your incumbent providers. Our scale up process, I'll leave you with this, is right now dramatically growing. Our funding is supported by the Carlyle Group. And this just happened in the last month. Their desires are very large. They are municipally and community oriented across the globe, particularly in America and North America. And their sponsorship, this private equity infrastructure sponsorship, is from blue collar America. Their funds are from pension funds. And so the reason we've partnered together is very simple, that if we can support communities and communities want to grow, retain their residents by providing, frankly, another utility service, leveraging a for-profit entity like a Wired, hopefully we can be your solution. And I can't wait for questions, Jeff, and to hear from me.
John, that was great, and I appreciate it. Another thing I wanted to mention, much like Cox, Wired is very active in the digital inclusion side of this. One of the things I was pleased to learn was they serve a lot of our seniors in the far west valley of Phoenix, in terms of Sun City and Sun City West, and they have a great program to help them get digitally literate. We talk about different groups, but as the son of two seniors that I had to get them registered for their COVID shots. Sometimes it helps to have a provider. Actually, it does help to have a provider who's willing to work with you. So thank you so much, John. I appreciate it. Next up, we've got Amy Rodriguez. Amy is the Vice President at TWN. TWN may be a name that y'all haven't heard all that much. They're sort of the company behind the company. I'll tell you one name that hopefully you've heard if you've attended our various events is Mojave Electric up in Bullhead City, Arizona. The electric cooperative, the first electric cooperative to get into the broadband business. And TWN is a big part of that. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Amy to talk a little about their model and what they're doing with Mojave Electric up in Bullhead City.
Okay, thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you to everyone else for attending and being a panelist today. I'm really excited to be here. A little bit about TWN Communications. We've been in business, we're right in the middle, 25 years. We've been working with electric cooperatives primarily to serve unserved and underserved areas with broadband solutions. We're now starting to work with municipalities as well. Insofar as Arizona is concerned, we deployed a fixed wireless network in 2005, which spans from Mojave Valley all the way down through Cochise County. And now our primary focus is to work with these electric cooperatives and municipalities to deploy carrier-grade fiber optic networks. One thing that makes us a little bit different, and the reason why we do what we do it's because of slides 1 through 50. These are really complex, really expensive, potentially high-risk projects. And so to work in a public-private type of partnership, we have found to be the most successful, where you're equally invested along with your partner, you're doing it together. Our model's a little different in that we like to be at the beginning of that whole flow chart. So from feasibility study all the way through to design, build, and then we stay on to operate. We're a scale provider that allows our electric cooperative partners primarily to plug into our scale. If they're not accustomed or don't have the appetite to have an entire broadband department or subsidiary, that's where we come into play. We do this together, we're in it for the long term, and we kind of handhold the process and work together, both financially and operationally from start to in perpetuity. Right now, our most exciting project, as Jeff was mentioning, is with Mojave Electric Cooperative. We're working with them to deploy a 100% fiber optic network to all 40,000 plus of their cooperative members. These are people in really rural areas. There will be a fiber drop at each and every Mojave Electric meter, whether the customer decides to take our service or not. That's because Mojave's using this also as a plant upgrade for their infrastructure to be able to deploy smart grid things, to be able to read the meter at the customer premise. So it's really exciting. This is a game changer for this community, and we're real excited to continue on with this project. Look forward to questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Amy. I really appreciate you making the time to be on our panel as well. It's a very exciting project up in Mojave County, and we're excited to see what's next with TWN. Kyle or Shimei, how are we doing with the questions? Do you want to go ahead and just open it up, or do you want to go ahead and read from the chat if we have any questions there?
Let's go ahead and open it up. So if people would like to ask a question, they'll please raise your hand, which is a button in your controls, and we will open it up for you guys.
Well, everyone's trying to figure out how to find their hands here. I'd like to ask a question, actually. I'd like to ask a question of Susan. I have heard about a Cox owned by company called UPN doing business in Arizona, and I've heard some really good stuff of what they've done in Yuma and are looking in other areas. Can you talk a little bit about UPN, the relationship with Cox, and how you see that company operating in the next few years?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Yeah, one thing probably not a lot of people are aware of. Cox acquired an interest in UPN a couple of years ago. They're a fiber company, and they don't have a huge presence in Arizona at this time, but as Jeff mentioned, they are in Yuma County. And so they are a fiber construction and delivery model, and they operate in other states as well. For example, in New Mexico, they are a provider and actually serve the Albuquerque School District. So they do have the potential to be, you know, a partner in possible public-private partnership solutions because of the amount of fiber that they do have available. So that is that's a Cox interest and part of our Cox suite of services that we do have. And I appreciate the question, Jeff.
Oh, good stuff. Shmei, do we have any questions up yet, or should I move on to question number 2?
We have Julie Brooks with a question.
Okay, Julie,
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
can you speak up just a little bit, Julie?
Can you hear me now, Jeff?
A little bit better, sure.
Okay. We are in Wickenburg, and at times we're kind of in between what can be provided for us. In the 33 years I've been here in this seat as executive director of the chamber, we started with dial-up, and now thankfully we do have Cox in some of the areas, Susan. We have CenturyLink, and we have AirNet, but many of the other areas we are just left without. So my question is, how do we make sure that a rural community in Maricopa County, 55 miles north of Central Phoenix, can get additional need for broadband?
John, would you like to answer that one?
Sure, Jeff and Julie. I'll offer a wired point of view, and the short answer is the collaboration your community has already initiated, outreach to others like Wired, I believe will pay dividends sooner than later. I suspect Cox will continue to expand services. Obviously, Susan will address that. But Wired has a strong desire to support the community. We are right now collaborating on a community survey to see where the need is most and what the needs are. Given the size of your community, the actual build and implementation process, once the planning effort is done and the PPP, the partnership, is established with the community, is really as short as a 3 to 4 month effort and no longer than a 6-month effort because of the size and configuration of your community. So I look forward to continuing to personally work to support, as does the team. And if there is a better way, if there is a better provider, then hats off to them. But I think that in short, because your community, your leadership in the community has been in an outreach mode, you all are going to find a partner, and I hope it's Wired very shortly. And that's the answer to your question. Just keep doing that, and it's going to work soon.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Our next question, we have Michelle Simon.
Great. Good afternoon. Well, it is afternoon, no, almost anyway. Michelle, I'm the Deputy Director of Support Services for the Pima County Public Library. And my question is actually directed to Susan. Back in the day, I used to be the Program Coordinator for Workforce and Economic Development for the library. And with the Public Library Association, we had some various events related to Connect to Compete. It was a really great effort. And basically, you know, we're coming out of this COVID-19 thing, and how do we come back around to making those valuable partnerships between the library and Pima County and Cox in this way? What ideas do you have about that?
Well, thank you, Michelle, and hello. It's nice to connect with you. And yes, we too share the enthusiasm you have for the partnership we've had with Pima County and your library system there. In fact, our president and CEO came out to help us announce our Connect to Compete partnership with you guys. It just feels like a few years ago. We're looking forward to continuing the dialogue to figure out how things are going to change with the way people need access to and consume broadband, whether the hardline connection to the home is the best solution, or we need to look for additional opportunities in the community to connect people. And, you know, we're very excited to do both. We do, as you know, we've got our technology centers locally. We want to continue to partner with libraries and other institutions to find ways to connect people, whether they've got a hardline access point into the home or they need to access their internet through other community partners like the library system. And so I think we too are trying to figure out, what does that look like? What are the demands and needs of the community as we're recovering and coming out of this pandemic, and trying to make sure we don't lose those connectivity options and continue to grow them. Look forward to working with you.
Awesome. Thank you, Susan. We have time for one more question, and I have Sharika Jackson.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thanks for, so my question is also to Cox in regards to your $9.99 plan, and you're saying you're allowing bundle. As far as the nonprofits and being able to do that, I don't know where the information is at in regards to nonprofits. I knew it was for schools and businesses, but I was just curious where that information is at. And when you say bundle, is there a limit? Is it 5, 10, 20? Like, what's the minimum to say a bundle? And the second question is, could it be paid a year in advance, or does it have to be paid monthly?
Great question, Sharika. And yes, we can, as I mentioned, we can set up a bulk account for any interested party, whether it's a nonprofit, a school, or a local community. We can provide increments of subsidization in $5 increments, starting at $5 up to as much as the partner wants to help pay for. And we can certainly arrange for payment in advance. I know that's going to be an important issue as dollars are available and decisions are being made. And, you know, we want to clearly communicate with the customers and the end users what they can expect. Those are things that we can certainly do. And I'm happy to have a conversation with you online. You're welcome to reach out to me. I don't know if Jeff, if there's information to be shared about panels for contact information, but certainly happy if you or anybody else wants to reach out to me about opportunities to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sharika. I actually have a really quick question for Amy. One of the challenges we've had is getting other electric cooperatives to jump into the broadband business. They're very conservative companies. They're electric companies. What have you seen in other parts of the country? What sort of encouragement? I've heard about polling members. I've heard all kinds of stuff. Do you have any advice for communities that have an electric cooperative that want to get into the business?
Yeah, I would definitely say, because electric cooperatives have such an affinity with their communities, to really speak up. I mean, the members of an electric cooperative are technically the owners, right? They're member owners. So if there's a need in a community, they have every right to talk to that board of directors and talk to that electric cooperative management team and try to get an initiative going. So I would say start grassroots. That's always been the key to success for us. That's why we work with electric cooperatives, because of that affinity with their communities, and you know, the loudest voices generally get heard.
Thank you. And all you out here who are in communities with electric cooperatives, please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, and I'll be happy to connect you with Amy as well. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you.
All right, Karen, where are we here? I think we got you on mute.
Has to happen at least once. I think we're ready to wrap it up. I think that that's what we're ready for. So give me the next slide. We've already given you a hint as to what the workshop topics are for our next session. The questions are all about the asset inventory conversation that we had earlier on, which was sort of the middle of Dawn's presentation. So it's about what are the physical assets in your community that you can leverage in order to build your own network, or to have a conversation with a service provider to lower the cost of their network build. But what are the community assets that you might be able to leverage for a network? And how can you use your rights of way to lower that build cost? And so we're asking you to think about those things in order to have a more detailed conversation about that in our upcoming TA session, which will be on the 21st. Next slide. And we've changed the time for one of our TA sessions. The Maricopa session was in the middle of the day, but Broadband USA has got a regular webinar series that's going to conflict with that on a normal basis. And so we've asked you guys to move that to an 8:30 time slot. And so we moved you to the morning so that you can attend our grants webinars if you would like to do that. And so that is now an earlier session. So this is the detailed information, and I've put the sign up information in the chat if you would like to sign up for any of these sessions. I think most of us who attended the last one did enjoy it and got to know each other a little bit better. So we're hoping that you'll participate in the upcoming TA sessions and sign up for either the one that is appropriate to your region, or just the one that fits your calendar if your regional one is not a good fit for you. Next slide. If you missed the March 3rd session, or if you just want to hear it again, you can use the link in the slides or go to the Arizona Commerce Authority website in order to rewatch that, that presentation. You can also, or to see this one again, you can also sign up for the next presentation, which is on using data as a foundation to your broadband plan. And this is, of course, the agenda for the upcoming presentations. Next slide. I also wanted to tell you a little bit, this is to tell you just a little bit about what we're going to cover in the data session. The purpose of the data session is twofold. One is to give you an overview of the three major broadband data sets that support the pre-measured federal data sets that support broadband. One is from the FCC, and then two of them are consumer data sets, one from NTIA and one is from the US Census Bureau. But more important than that is a focus on tools and how you can use various tools to get access to the data so that you can use those tools to download the data and customize it and use it in your planning, and then add your own local insights to the data in order to kind of filter it with your own perspective. And so I think that's what's going to make it more effective than just kind of taking all the data at face value from a federal perspective, because that's what will make it more effective in your local planning. Being able to use multiple data sources together, including local speed tests in addition to the federal data. So that's what we will focus on in the data workshop. Next slide. Also wanted to highlight that NTIA is launching this month a huge for us webinar series to focus on the new grant programs that we have been invited to develop and launch. We have 3 grant programs. One of them is a
1 billion tribal grant program, 300 million broadband infrastructure development program, and 285 million for connecting minority communities program.
And we have just, we will announce tomorrow a change in the schedule for some of the webinars. So the webinar that was originally scheduled for April 14th and 15th, the infrastructure one, has just been moved to April 28th and 29th. So if you happen to have been signed up for the April 14th webinar, your registration will automatically be moved to April 28th and 29th. And you will get a notice on that either today or tomorrow. But we will still be having monthly webinars throughout all of April, May, June, and July in order to support people who are applying for those infrastructure, tribal, and connecting minority community grants in order to give you all of the information that you need to put together great grant applications. We're just rolling out the first one just a little bit later. So you'll get lots of information on that throughout this entire process, and you can get more information on our website, and I'm putting that link in the chat as well. Next slide. And did you want to add anything else, Scott?
No.
Thank you for helping me out with the numbers. They're so big, I have trouble getting my head around them. And I wanted to thank all of our partners again. Jeff, of course, as the host from the Arizona Commerce Authority, the entire team at NTIA who works behind the scenes and in the front of the scenes to help make this happen. Both Tim O'Connell and Steve Mosier from USDA, as well as Cindy Patak from EDA, who is a great partner both at headquarters and on the ground to help make this work. And most all, we appreciate all of you guys for being a part of this in all the work that you do in the field and as part of this program. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Karen. And again, thank you, Steve and Cindy. You know, we didn't get a chance to really highlight their agencies today, but they have some excellent grant programs out there. So if you get an opportunity, please do take a look at the USDA and the EDA grant programs for broadband.
And we'll be showcasing them in an upcoming webinar where we'll be talking about federal funding and local funding as well. Anybody who wants to exit, this is a great time to exit. And if anybody had questions that they didn't get answered and you want to stay a little bit longer, if you can stand it, you are more than welcome to stay a few minutes and we will do our best to answer your questions.
Thank you, everyone.
Shemay, can you tell if there's anybody here who has a question that they want to ask?
We have Stephen Peterson who has his hand up from earlier. So if you're still on and you'd like to make a comment, Stephen, you're on.
Can you guys hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, okay. We can.
Perfect, thank you. So this was really a great presentation, a lot of high level value, and I think you know we have a lot of work cut out for us. I'm Stephen. I am the Economic Recovery Coordinator for SEGO, so I cover the southeastern region of Arizona, including Cochise, Graham, Greenlee, and Santa Cruz County. ultimately, my biggest question is the best way to get in touch with our panelists today who represent our internet service providers, because we're in the middle of our planning grant right now, and we know that an outreach to you would make a lot of sense right now, just going forward, to start building relationship and weighing our options and identifying possible paths forward. I think Jeff mentioned earlier that he would be willing to make introductions. So if that's the most appropriate way to do this, then that's what I'll do.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm here to help.
Okay, perfect.
You have the contact information?
Yeah, yes, I do.
And a question from Missy.
It says her question is there a networking forum to connect with each other after this video? Which is essentially on par with the other question. So please reach out to Jeff and he should be able to get contact information of the panelists.
Yeah, in terms of a network also, something that we've done is we formed broadband action teams in a good chunk of our communities and most of our counties. And these are great organizations to meet with folks that have the same interest in expanding broadband in your community, but maybe aren't from the same industry. You have folks from things like healthcare and government, and agriculture and higher ed and K-12, elected officials and municipal officials. And at the end of the day, everybody wants the same thing. Unfortunately, a lot of times there's a lot of duplication with people pursuing grants and projects for their individual use, when many times it makes the most sense to work as a community or even as a county. So if you can let me know where you're at, I'll be happy to hook you up with a group in your area.
And also, I think you're just reminding us that it would be great if we could, Jeff keeps inviting all of us from Broadband USA to join him in Arizona in August. He tells us it's a great time to come.
Wonderful here.
Yeah. John, you think he's pulling my leg?
John's in Boulder, so he probably shouldn't comment on that right now.
No, Karen, that is just really not kind of Jeff. That's what I'm saying.
I kept asking for February, but he keeps telling me, no, August is really the best time to come. That's how much I love broadband, that I would come to Arizona in August.
Well, I will tell you this, Karen, you can get a really nice hotel room in Phoenix in August at a very nice resort for not a whole lot of money. So you'd be surprised.
I'm on the government rate. I pay the same amount wherever I go, anywhere.
All right. Fair enough.
So, but I think whenever if we do hope that we can do an event at some point in time, and one of the advantages of a physical event actually is that you do actually get to really network with people, and you get to make those connections that we used to make when we were actually in person. And I think that comment kind of really goes to that you really can't do that in the virtual call.
Well, Karen, I'll say this, our last session, I believe, is July. If all goes well, I would love to have a wrap-up session here in August if the COVID mitigation measures have taken fully effect, and invite our panelists and folks who have attended the webinars. We have an excellent conference facility here at the Arizona Commerce Authority. For those of you who watched Governor Ducey's COVID briefings with Dr. Kara Chris, they do those there. It's a large room with a very large wall of monitors. I've always wanted to see myself on those monitors, so we have to do something like that. But and we will provide some water and snacks if that's allowed with our federal partners. So let's start looking towards August. I think that'd be fun.
All right, that sounds great, and it sounds like your audience would appreciate that as well. It sounds like you have a number of people here who would like to make some connections with each other. We can't give information of attendees to each other, but if people ask for it, I'm sure you can give information of attendees to each other.
Absolutely. We're all about connecting, and also connecting with carriers. I think a lot of times folks don't know where to go next. And Douglas with Cox is a good example of a community that needed help, and we put them together with Cox, and we came up with a really interesting solution for that town. So I think a lot of times it's just asking the questions. Don't be afraid to ask for help.
And Shemay said she's got another question.
So the question is, so the technical session coming up on April 21st is about Arizona assets or community assets as well as rights of way. And the questions to the panelists, essentially, what are some of the experiences you guys have had, like difficulties with Arizona asset or getting, looking at assets and rights of way?
I'm happy to offer a simple point of view. I think the single largest difficulty is that there has been a spike in the interest of counties and municipalities to charge recurring rights of way fees in a discriminatory way. So what I would recommend is that municipalities huddle amongst themselves together with others, and firstly read the 1996 Telecom Act, which says that municipalities are entitled to cost recovery. But broadly, if the objectives are, more broadband deployment, more inclusion, creating barriers like that, particularly for perhaps entrants that would be interested in supporting communities, it just doesn't make sense. I understand it, but I've been a councilman as well for 8 years, and it just doesn't make sense in my point of view.
And I would just add to it, oftentimes, that's a great point, John, for new market entrants, for startups and WISP that are available and have business models that work for less populated areas, it does at times, oftentimes, serve as a barrier for that market entrant to fully participate. So that is a good point. And perhaps we can, focus on some of our upcoming sessions on, just discussing that issue because it has served not just in Arizona, other areas of the country. We're hearing from particularly the startup service provider community that municipal, attachment fees, make ready costs, you name it, are all operating as barriers for successful entrants to service certain areas.
Yeah, just to reiterate what Scott said, we hear this from the wireless providers as well. 5G is something that's being rolled out nationwide by T-Mobile, AT&T, and Verizon, and they have a choice where they go first. And if you want your community to be at the front end of that spectrum relative to communities your size around the country, make it easy for them to do business in your community. Electricity, adequate fiber backhaul, and a willing municipal government. That's what I was told by one provider in no uncertain terms. Whether they come here or they go to Oregon or they go to New Hampshire to a light community, a lot's going to depend on that. I do my best to market our communities to them for expansion. For those of you who aren't familiar, T-Mobile has to put up a lot of rural towers as a result of their merger with Sprint. And I'm constantly beating the drum for Arizona. So make it easy for them to do business in your community, and you will get more development.
Thank you, Jeff, John, and Scott for those comments. There are no other questions in the queue.
Thank you, panelists. I really liked hearing from all of you.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for showing up. This was a fantastic panel. And like I said, we'd love to have an event at the end where we can get John out of Boulder down here to Phoenix. And Amy, you're coming from Florida, so it can't be that much worse here. So.
It's pretty bad in Sarasota right now, let me tell you. Miserable.
All righty.
I'll
Good
be there
stuff.
Thank you,
Take
Jeff.
care.
Panelists.
Okay.
All right, thank you all.
All right.
Bye-bye.